Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Boko Haram. I think most people know the name, they've seen the headlines. But today we're going to go a little bit deeper to understand how this group splintered, evolved, and even governs. We're going to unpack what makes these factions tick so that by the end of this deep dive, you'll be way ahead of the curve on this conflict.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that this isn't just about fighting governments.
Yeah.
Their story is really about internal struggles, this constant reshaping of power, and figuring out what to call them even is tricky.
Yeah, because Boko Haram itself is a nickname, right? Like something critics called them.
Exactly. It means Western education is forbidden. And it kind of stuck. Even though they've gone through all these different names, Sophia, JASDJ, ISWAP, they're kind of trying to rebrand themselves with every split almost.
Right.
It really shows you right off the bat that this isn't some unified movement. It's a constantly shifting landscape of alliances and rivalries.
So this fracturing, this isn't a new thing. It started way back, right?
Yeah.
In their early days.
Absolutely. You can trace it back to the early 2000s. There was already a split between Muhammad Ali and Muhammad Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram. And it wasn't just about disagreements on ideology, which you might expect, but also about control, like how strictly they should adhere to their interpretation of Islam, right? So there was a power struggle from the get-go.
And then, if I'm remembering correctly, 2009 was kind of a big turning point, right? Wasn't that a huge news story at the time?
Yeah, the uprising in Maiduguri, it was brutally crushed by the Nigerian government. And Muhammad Yusuf was killed, so you have this power vacuum that ultimately led to further splintering. And it's also when you see these external players like Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb or AQIM, they saw an opportunity to try to influence the movement.
So is that where we see like Ansaru emerging? I vaguely remember that name. Weren't they operating kind of outside of the Northeast?
Yeah, Ansaru emerged from that chaos post-2009, but they never really gained the same strength as the main faction, which by then had come under the leadership of Abubakar Shekau.
And that is where things took, I think, a really dark turn. Shekau's brutality was on another level.
Absolutely. Under Shekau, the violence just escalated drastically. They shifted from these targeted attacks to this widespread and indiscriminate brutality, which you can imagine alienated some members. And that, combined with the growing influence of ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, kind of set the stage for another major split.
Okay, so this is where the story gets really interesting, I think, for a lot of people. So in 2015, Shekau pledges allegiance to ISIL, and JASDJ becomes ISWAP, the Islamic State West Africa province, right? But it wasn't quite that simple, was it?
No, there's always a twist.
Shekau, despite pledging allegiance, was really resistant to ISIL's control. I kind of think of it like a teenager who wants to hang with the cool kids but refuses to follow their rules. So he's clashing with commanders, even executing some who are aligned with ISIL. So by 2016, his critics have had enough. A group led by Habib Yusuf, Muhammad Yusuf's son no less, break away. And what's wild is that ISIL actually sides with the dissenters and recognizes Habib as the new leader of ISWAP.
Yeah, so essentially now you have two distinct Boko Harams. You have Shekau's JSDJ, which is isolated and furious, and then this new ISWAP, which is attempting to build a much more organized, I guess you could say, state-like entity with ISIL's backing.
And this is a key point, I think, for our listeners to understand, because these two factions are very different, not just in leadership, but in their entire approach.
Right. ISWAP isn't just about fighting, it's about governing. So, for instance, they're offering protection to Muslim civilians in exchange for taxes. Huge contrast to Shekau's, reign of terror. They've got departments for preaching, an Islamic police force. They've got courts, even an internal security service.
It's like they're playing nation state, right? Like you said, they have a structured military hierarchy and then this internal security service, the AMNIA, to keep their own members in line. I mean, that is a whole other level of organization than you would think of when you think of this group.
Yeah, exactly. They have a level of sophistication that I think often gets missed in the news. This isn't just a band of militants. It's a group with a long-term vision and, honestly, the potential to achieve it.
But of course, Shekau's JSDJ didn't just disappear.
No, not at all. They retreated into three main enclaves, but what's really interesting is that even as they kind of cling to these older tactics of plundering, like Bakura Doro, who controls the Lake Chad area, he started implementing like a rudimentary tax system. He's even issuing receipts.
So they're trying to copy ISWAP's playbook a little bit.
It seems like they've seen that it can be an effective way to secure resources and consolidate power. So even as they're clinging to the older tactics, there's a hint of adaptation there, which I think is worth noting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we've got these two very different factions with very different approaches to power, to violence. But then in 2021, another major shift happens. Shakao dies.
Yeah, and his death throws everything into turmoil. He's cornered by ISWAP forces, and he chooses to detonate his suicide vest rather than surrender.
Hmm.
And ISWAP tries to capitalize on this. They're reaching out to JSICH commanders. They're calling for unity under their banner.
And did it work? I mean, these groups were pretty fundamentally opposed to each other.
It was far more complicated than that. Some JSDJ fighters surrendered to authorities, others resisted ISWAP's overtures, and either stuck with existing splinter groups or formed new ones. It was really kind of all over the place.
So Shakao's death didn't end the conflict, it just reshaped it.
Exactly. New alliances and rivalries emerge, and figures like Bokoharam, who might have been overshadowed by Shakao, rise to prominence.
This Bokoharam seems like a key player in all of this.
He is, and his story shows that this isn't simply about one group replacing another. Bakura consolidated control in the Lake Chad region by eliminating rivals and forming these strategic alliances, particularly with the Buduma ethnic group. He's a shrewd operator, he's blending force with strategic alliances, and even adopting some of ISWAP's governance tactics.
So it's not as simple as saying, ISWAP is the organized one and JSDJ is the chaotic one. There's a lot more nuance here, a lot more gray area.
Exactly. And to understand this conflict, you need to go beyond these simple labels and really examine how these factions operate, who they are, what motivates them.
And that's what we'll be doing in part 2 of this deep dive. We're going to take a closer look at the organizational structures, leadership dynamics, and even the governance strategies that make these factions tick. Trust me, it's way more complex than just terrorists with guns. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Boko Haram. So we've established that this isn't just one big group, but rather two main factions, ISWAP and JSDJ. And each has its own characteristics, its own approaches to power. We left off talking about Bokoharam kind of adopting some of ISWAP's governance tactics, and that really highlights how we need to understand how each of these groups is structured, how they actually function.
You're absolutely right. It's so easy to kind of just, label them all as terrorists, but it's so much more complex than that. So let's dig into ISWAP, the faction that's actively trying to establish itself as a governing force.
Okay, so how do they organize themselves? Is it like a traditional military with a clear hierarchy?
It's more nuanced than that. I kind of think of it as like a blend of military structure and bureaucratic administration. They divide their territory into two main provinces, kind of like states, and those are further divided into districts. So it's a layered system of control. But what makes it really interesting is that they also have these councils made up of religious figures and officials that advise their leaders.
So there's like a system of checks and balances, almost like a government.
Yeah, and to make it even more complex, they've introduced the Amniya, which is their internal security service. Think of them as like a secret police force within the group itself, right? They're responsible for enforcing rules, gathering intelligence on potential dissenters within their own ranks.
Whoa, so not only are they fighting external enemies, they're also keeping a very tight grip on their own members. That's a level of control I wouldn't have expected.
Exactly, but it speaks to their ambition to not just conquer territory, but actually control it. And they're doing this through a combination of military force and this, really intricate internal security apparatus. It's pretty sophisticated.
But who's actually calling the shots at the top? Is there like a single leader, or is it more of a collective leadership?
That's where it gets really, really interesting. ISWAP's leadership is closely linked with the leadership of the Islamic State Sahel province, which operates in Mali. And both groups fall under the umbrella of what's called the Al-Furqan office, kind of a coordinating body within the larger Islamic State. But from what we've been able to gather, it seems that ISWAP holds significant influence within Al-Furqan.
So they're not just taking orders from some far-off command center. They're actually shaping the strategy
exactly.
of the Islamic State in this region.
Precisely. Two key figures emerge, Habib Yusuf, who we talked about earlier, and Abubakar Mainak. And they seem to operate as this sort of dynamic duo, with Habib handling communication and strategy with the larger Islamic State, while Mainak focuses on the day-to-day operations of ISWAP itself.
So you have kind of a strategist and a field commander.
Exactly.
Each playing a critical role. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around how this actually translates to governance. How does ISWAP administer the territory they control?
They've developed, again, a surprisingly bureaucratic system. It's likely influenced by ISIL's model in Iraq and Syria. So each district has its own leader who reports up the chain to the provincial leaders. And remember those councils I mentioned, Those play a role here, advising the leaders on matters of governance.
So they have leadership, they have advisors, internal security. Are they, like, paying their fighters salaries?
There have been attempts to implement a system of wages, although it seems to be mostly limited to commanders and administrators. Not quite a 9-to-5 job with benefits, but
Right.
there's a sense of structure and organization that sets them apart from other militant groups.
It's like they're running a terrorist corporation.
Well, I mean, it's not quite that simple. This system, for all its sophistication, has its flaws. It creates friction and resentment, especially among former ASEJ fighters who were forced to adapt to ISWA's strict rules after Shekau's death.
Makes sense. Speaking of JSDJ, let's shift gears and delve into their world for a bit. So we know they're currently controlling 3 main enclaves, right?
That's right. The islands Lake Chad, the Gwoza Hills, and then an area near Bama. Each enclave has its own commander, but Bakuradoro, who we talked about earlier, seems to have emerged as the kind of overall leader.
So what's their leadership structure like? Anything like ISWAP's more organized approach?
Not even close. JSDJ relies very heavily on personal relationships and loyalty to their commanders. A lot less emphasis on formal structures or bureaucracy.
So more of a classic warlord setup. Makes sense given their focus on plunder and ransom.
Exactly. But as we touched on earlier, even JSDJ is showing some signs of adaptation. Bakuradoro, particularly, has implemented that rudimentary tax system in the Lake Chad region.
It seems like they're trying to legitimize their control even while still relying on that force and intimidation. Almost like they're looking at ISWAP and realizing, hey, maybe there's a more effective way to operate.
That's one interpretation. They've seen this approach can be effective in securing resources and consolidating power. But whether this signals a genuine shift in strategy or just a tactical adjustment, that remains to be seen.
So we have these 2 factions, very different leadership structures, but what about their actual fighting capabilities? Who has the upper hand militarily?
That's a constantly shifting landscape. In the immediate aftermath of Shekau's death, ISWAP definitely seemed to be in a dominant position, but JSDJ's proven to be a very resilient adversary.
And I'm guessing there have been some clashes between them, right? I can't imagine they're just peacefully coexisting.
You're right, there have been some significant clashes, especially in the Lake Chad region. Bakuradoro, in particular, has challenged ISWAP's control. He's even managed to seize some key areas.
So it's not just a rivalry, it's an active power struggle, with both sides vying for control of territory, resources. And it's probably about more than just land and resources, right? There's got to be that ideological element at play, too.
Absolutely. Remember, these groups were born from these ideological splits, and each faction believes that their vision of, quote, true Islam is the correct one. And that just adds another layer of complexity to their rivalry. It's not just about who has the most guns. It's about who has the stronger claim to legitimacy in the eyes of their followers.
It's fascinating how this conflict isn't just about brute force. It's about controlling the narrative, about convincing people that your way is the right way. It's almost like a battle for hearts and minds as much as a battle for territory.
That's a really insightful observation, and it gets to the heart of what makes this conflict so difficult to address. It's not just about military strength. It's about ideology, belief, and a struggle for influence within a very specific cultural and religious context.
This has been incredibly helpful in understanding the inner workings of these factions. But, before we wrap up, I think there's one more element we need to consider, and we haven't even touched on it yet. The ethnic dimension.
Yes, ethnicity. It plays such a critical role in shaping the dynamics of this conflict. We're talking about a region with diverse ethnic groups, each with their own history, their own relationships to power. And those identities absolutely influence how these factions operate.
I have to admit, that's where I get a little lost. Like, how does ethnicity actually play into all of this?
Well, for starters, ethnic ties can be a very powerful force for recruitment and mobilization. They can also fuel rivalries and even lead to internal divisions within the groups themselves. It's a complex web of allegiances and tensions that we'll unpack in Part 3.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Boko Haram. We've been talking about their splintering, the organizational structures, their leadership, but as we kind of hinted at in the last part, there's another piece of this whole puzzle, right? The role of ethnicity.
Yeah, it's critical, and honestly, it's easy to overlook if you're just looking at the headlines. We're talking about a region with all these different ethnic groups, like the Kanuri, the Fulani, the Buduma, and so many others. And these identities influence everything. Alliances, rivalries, even the way the factions themselves are structured internally.
So it's not like when someone joins Boko Haram, they just like leave their ethnic identity at the door or something.
Not at all. Ethnic ties can actually be a huge factor in recruitment, mobilization, even in terms of internal control. Think of Bakuradoro, the DJ leader we've been talking about, in the Lake Chad region. He's strategically built alliances with the Buduma people, even though he himself isn't Buduma.
It's almost like he's using ethnicity to solidify his power base. Like it's a game of chess, and each ethnic group is a piece on the board.
That's a great analogy. And just like in chess, those pieces can sometimes clash. Ethnic tensions can lead to internal divisions, even violent clashes within the factions. Remember we talked about Kila, that ISWAP commander who defected to JSDJ?
Yeah. He was the one who felt that ISWAP wasn't giving the Burduma enough recognition for their role in the group, right?
Exactly. And his defection, and the fact that he got support from other Buduma fighters, just shows how powerful those ethnic grievances can be as a motivator. And it's not just a JSDJ thing either. ISWAP has had its own internal tensions along ethnic lines.
So these leaders are really walking a tightrope here, right? Like they need those ethnic ties to build support, but they also have to manage them very, very carefully to keep everything from falling apart.
For sure, and it's not just about the internal dynamics of these factions. It also affects how they interact with the communities they operate in. Like, think about ISWAP's whole strategy of providing protection services to Muslim civilians in exchange for taxes, for loyalty.
Oh, right. Because if they alienate certain ethnic groups, then that whole model could collapse.
Absolutely. To maintain legitimacy control, they need to be seen as protectors of all Muslims, regardless of their ethnicity. It's a balancing act, and one that's made even more complicated by, well, everything else. Ethnicity mixed with religion, politics, the whole history of power dynamics in the region.
So it's not just a fight for territory or resources, but also for the hearts and minds of the people. And ethnicity plays a huge role in that.
You got it. Understanding the ethnic dimension is crucial, not just for understanding Boko Haram, but for anyone trying to address this conflict, to find a path towards peace. Military solutions alone aren't going to cut it. You have to address the underlying stuff. Grievances, inequalities, political marginalization, all the things that fuel the violence in the first place.
So we need to look beyond the headlines, beyond the simple narratives.
Exactly. This is complex, it has deep roots, no easy solutions, but the first step is recognizing that complexity and engaging with the region in a way that's sensitive to all of it. Ethnicity, religion, local politics.
I gotta say, this deep dive has been really eye-opening for me. I feel like I have a much better grasp of Boko Haram, the factions and the factors that are driving this whole conflict.
And remember, this is just a starting point.
Yeah.
Always more to learn, always more to dig into.
To all our listeners out there, don't stop here. Keep researching, keep asking questions, keep challenging those assumptions you might have about Boko Haram, about the Lake Chad Basin. It's a region with a rich history, incredibly complex dynamics, and it's worth understanding.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, knowledge is power. The more we understand this conflict, the better equipped we are to, hopefully find solutions, work towards a more peaceful future for the region. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.